let's get a word on this and the other big stories of the day. Chloe Dobbs, the political commentator, is back with us. How are you doing, Chloe?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Ian?
Good as gold at this end. I think it's fair to say you're an exponent, a supporter of free speech. But, you know, what a bizarre world we're in, Chloe, when this is even a discussion in the 21st century.
I know. I mean, there will be veterans turning in their graves because this, you know, they fought so hard to have these freedoms and until quite recently we took it as a given, but now we are actually really having to fight for basic free speech. And now we're hearing with this new workers' rights bill that it might be the case that if you're in the pub and you say there are only two genders and you've got someone working behind the bar who feels offended by that, then maybe the police will turn up and you'll be in handcuffs. It's pretty scary stuff.
It's utterly bizarre, isn't it? Well, let's have a reminder of what happened at the Department of Education. This is the Education Secretary, Bridget Phillipson, announcing when she decided to pause the commencement of the Higher Education Bill.
Mr. Speaker, this government is absolutely committed to freedom of speech and academic freedom. We want to make sure that our universities are places of intellectual challenge, of rigour, and where, yes, people will be exposed to views with which they might disagree. We did pause commencement of the previous government's legislation in this area because of serious concerns that were raised by very many people about how this legislation would apply, including from minority groups. We are consulting with stakeholders and we intend to set out our position in due course.
I mean, what does that even mean? She says, including from minority groups. We know we've had an MP agitating about having a more rigid legal position on Islamophobia, which is an extraordinary, very wide description that could cover absolutely anything. I mean, is that the kind of thing she's talking about? I don't think it's in the DNA of people like Phillipson to actually be supportive of free speech if it's free speech that they don't agree with.
Yeah, I think when she stands there and she says that this government stands behind free speech, we care about academic freedom, I think it's quite hard for people to believe her, given what happened over the summer, especially with a bunch of people being chucked in prison for Facebook posts. I think we're going to have to wait to see all of the detail of exactly what this watered-down version of the free speech bill is. I think that clearly, though, the actions of, for example, the Free Speech Union taking the government to court for throwing away this free speech legislation has had an effect, and now they're having to do a bit of a U-turn. But we'll see how bad this watered-down version is. I think that it is really, really important that we fight for free speech at universities because, I mean, the way it stands now, if universities keep going as they are, I say just bulldoze them because they're not serving any purpose. The whole point of university is to go there and learn to debate people, to learn to engage with difficult ideas. But what I noticed at university is that students who arrived very open-minded and interested in debate and talking to people they disagree with, they left not wanting to listen to anybody that they disagree with, being more shouty and unwilling to talk to anybody. I think also one thing that we need to stress is that this isn't just about academics and the university institutions. A lot of it is about the students, partly because of social media and, you know, the whole, say, pro-Gaza movement, for example, on social media, that's had a big impact on university campuses. You'll probably have students who absolutely despise and want fired any academic that they work with that is pro-Israel, for example. The students are pretty vicious.
Yeah, I mean, there is the problem, isn't it? I remember and this goes back about 10 years, when I think it was Jenny Murray, the broadcaster, I think was cancelled from giving a speech. I mean, we've had people like Jermaine Greer being cancelled, you know, for something to do with, I imagine, trans issues or whatever. You think, Jermaine Greer is hardly some sort of mad right-winger. You know, the first sort of known, you know, sort of well-known, famous feminist, if you want to look at it that way, and all manner of other people. And I interviewed the head of the student union at the time, or the people responsible for this particular debate, and she said, I mean, she was almost unapologetic. She said, well, we don't want her here because we disagree with her. You know, you can't say stuff like this. It's like, listen to yourself. You can't say stuff like this? What kind of mad, parochial, nonsensical world are we living in?
I know. I mean, what happened to that good old saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant?
Yeah.
If they think that someone is a hateful, racist human being, why don't you let them speak, and then everyone will see just how awful their arguments are. I had at my university, we had a very concerning situation where we had the Oxford Union wanted to have we had the why am I having a mind block of her name? The feminist, the gender critical feminist, Kathleen Stock. There we go. Yeah. Kathleen Stock. She wanted to speak, and then you had the Oxford Student Union. Not just saying we don't agree with you having her, but saying we are going to pull your funding away and stop the Oxford Union getting money from the Oxford Student Union if you dare to platform this person. Her views aren't even that radical. She doesn't necessarily say there are only two genders. She says, I'm fine with transgender people, I just don't want them in women's prisons and locker rooms. It's not that crazy. Yeah. But the storm around that, and the students as well, as I mentioned, they are vicious. The protests outside were horrendous. Someone came in and glued themselves to the floor. It's just absolutely bonkers. They glued themselves
because Kathleen Stock might be speaking.
Yes. Well, they did it in the middle of the event. We had to pause the event for half an hour, waiting for the police to come in and unglue her from the floor. It was just absolutely bonkers. And the reason why free speech on campus is so important is because if you're a student that gets caught up in, you said the wrong thing that someone finds offensive, it will potentially ruin your career. Remember, students at university, they're at the point where they are applying for graduate jobs. They are so concerned about what a Google search on their name comes up with. And if you're a normal person down the pub and you say something edgy, like there are only two genders, it's not going to end up on the front of the Telegraph. It's not going to come up in a Google search. But when you're at a university, there are all of these little student newspapers who will very happily write an article on one student who said there are only two genders at the pub. And then that's it. Your Google search, you're screwed.
You're screwed.
You're not going to get a job anymore. Anyone that Googles your name, you're done.
Yeah, because you had the audacity, the temerity, the lack of intelligence to suggest there might only be two genders. I mean, half an hour ago, you'd have been laughed out the room if you said anything other than that. But here we are in this new upside-down world where the rules have changed. Listen, Chloe, stay with us. We've got more stories to come. Tulip Sadiq named in a third Bangladesh inquiry into money laundering. The ceasefire, Israel and Hamas. Can that happen? And what if not suppose will mean that Joe Biden takes the glory on this and not Donald Trump? Maybe the acceleration is down to that.
Well, I think that actually Trump, although he's not actually in office yet and he hasn't had his inauguration, I think the anticipation of him coming in is what has caused Hamas to be more compromising and for both sides to be looking for a deal. Trump said, if when I get into office there's they've still got a single hostage, there is going to be hell for them. And it wasn't until Trump won the election that suddenly Hamas then said that they were open to a deal. So I think there's a good chance of something happening, but they need to make sure that every hostage is released. I don't think Israel is going to accept anything less than that. They're not just going to take a few of them and just leave some of their hostages captive there. I think for me, what I'm looking for is making sure that there is some kind of framework for the governance of Gaza after this. Else we could just end up with chaos breaking out again in the near future. We also need to think about how do we rebuild Gaza. You'll probably have some of the Gulf states help rebuild that area, but they're not going to be willing to do it if they think, it's all going to turn to rubble again if there's not proper governance here and there ends up being a war again in the future. I think that it's really important that Hamas do not regain power again, even if you've got rid of a lot of their top leaders. The ideology will still be present in the population because they brainwash them from a very, very young age in school. That's going to be a big difficulty, making sure that power doesn't fall into the wrong hands. So let's see what happens, but fingers crossed.
Indeed.
There can be a good outcome here.
Yeah, well, we all hope so, of course. But, this has been ongoing for so many years. Who knows whether there can be any kind of permanency. around whatever happens in the next few days. Let's hope so. And this is an interesting one. Nigel Farage has called on England to boycott next month's Champions Trophy match against Afghanistan by a group of more than 160 politicians, including Jeremy Corbyn and Lord Kinnock. He's in interesting company there. Let's have a listen to what Nigel Farage said on talkSPORT.
Inescapably, sport is part of international diplomacy. You can't get away from that. It's been the case forever, and it's not going to change. And I think the fact that women's cricket has been completely abolished in Afghanistan, frankly, along with women's rights, is something we ought to make a stand over. And I kind of feel that the ECB's been vacillating a little bit over this. I mean, look, we didn't play against South Africa because they banned black players during apartheid. It would be completely inconsistent to say we're going to play cricket against a country that now bans women from playing it.
I mean, that sounds fairly reasonable, Chloe.
Yeah, I agree that we should boycott this, but I wouldn't completely agree with Nigel that sport needs to always be part of international diplomacy. I don't think that we should ban countries from taking part in something just because we don't like their politics. You know, most athletes, they're just individuals who have worked very, very hard, and if they are the best athlete, they usually, you know, they deserve the medal. It's not their fault what country they were born into. But when it is a case where the governing body of the sport is not agreeing with the rules laid out, in this case by the International Cricket Council, which says that you must allow female participants, then I think that there is scope to use a boycott, for example, to hold that governing body accountable. Now, obviously, that governing body is in a very difficult position when the Taliban are the ones in charge. They probably don't have much choice in this, but it does send a pretty strong message to Afghanistan that they need to do something about female rights. Not sure if they'll listen, but there needs to be some kind of accountability. I mean, I feel so sorry for the women there. You know, not only are they not allowed to play cricket, but they're not even allowed to have windows on their houses now. We're now hearing. I mean, these women they're gonna get scurvy. They're not allowed to have windows in their houses. They have to be completely covered up when they go outside. They're not allowed to go to the gym. They've got no freedom whatsoever. It's a pretty miserable life there, pretty scary situation.
I cannot wait to hear the Taliban on Test Match Special. That's going to be interesting. Good point. We will watch again with interest. Final one here. The Prison Officers Association criticised for hiring of prison officers via Zoom, calling for a return to in-person interviews. You might think that something like a prison officer would be absolutely crucial that you would meet face-to-face somebody that you were going to hire in such a responsible role. I mean, not least, you know, if someone's a prison officer, I want them to be about 6'6" and just as wide. You know, I don't want them to sort of sit there with a grainy old screen working out, you know, what they've got to say on Zoom. I mean, this is bonkers.
I mean, I don't have a problem with doing interviews on Zoom. I think maybe you narrow it down to your final few on Zoom and then bring them in person, make sure you do a trial day and whatnot before you actually get them into a job contract. But I think we shouldn't use this story as, you know, a scapegoat for the problems in the prison system and the lack of skill amongst the prison officers. There are plenty of other issues. So, for example, apparently the pay is just doesn't pay anymore. It's a pretty hostile environment. You'd be better off doing some other job that pays the same, where you're not having to be surrounded by crazy criminals all day. A lot of them put themselves in very dangerous situations there. And also you've just got massively overcrowded prisons and not enough prison officers. The prison officers there, not only are they wanting to leave because it's a pretty miserable time when you haven't got enough staff around you to support you, but yeah, the prisons, they're just not being run well because they simply do not have enough staff. A lot of people who are more experienced are leaving, and they'll choose more junior people because they are cheaper to hire. That is where I think the problem more so lies than the fact that they're doing interviews on Zoom.
Yeah. Apparently, they only get 6 weeks training as well. I mean, you'd think you'd be trained like a NASA astronaut when you're going to be a prison officer, bearing in mind what you're up against, what you're dealing with. I mean, the risks you take. 6 weeks. I mean, really? But again, as you say, you know, short of resources.
They're desperate to get people in. They haven't got time to wait more than 6 weeks, I guess.
Absolutely. Listen, Chloe, thank you as ever. Chloe Dobbs, the political commentator, with us on the programme.